England did not announce its cruelties with thunder. It delivered them quietly, in moments when dignity was taken without witnesses and grief was expected to be borne politely. The night her father died, no bell tolled for his learning, no voice rose to honor his careful hand over parish ledgers and forgotten tongues. What remained to his daughter was not inheritance, but silence, and the sudden knowledge that understanding words did not grant one authority in a world ruled by birth. She learned this lesson again each morning as she served strangers whose manners grew sharp the moment they noticed her speech was too precise for her apron. Politeness became a test she was expected to fail. A smile held too long invited mockery, a lowered gaze suggested guilt. She moved through her duties with restraint, knowing that any misstep would confirm what society already believed, that intellect in a woman without rank was an inconvenience best ignored. On one such evening, a remark delivered lightly struck deeper than open insult. A lady of modest title remarked, within careful hearing, that clever girls were prone to ambition, and ambition, when improperly placed, led only to disappointment. Laughter followed, soft and correct. The daughter of the parish clerk accepted the words as she had learned to accept rain, unavoidable, undeserving of reply but cold all the same. Shame in England rarely raised its voice. It was then that another burden entered the space of her awareness, though no announcement marked it. The Duke of Ashcombe carried with him a reputation for reserve and a future heavy with expectation. He was young enough to resent the inheritance of command, yet old enough to understand its inescapability. His name preceded him everywhere, and for that reason he spoke little, wary of how quickly words became obligations. He had left his estate under a cloud of unease that no council had resolved. For generations, the Ashcombe line had sworn itself to an oath few could properly read, and none could wholly explain. Each heir abated in form and violated it in spirit, and misfortune followed with grim consistency. Marriages hardened rather than healed. Duty misunderstood became punishment. The Duke felt this pattern closing around him, and the weight of it pressed more heavily than the title he bore. Restlessness led him to speak when he ought not to have done so. Waiting for circumstances to move in his favor, he murmured the oath as it had been handed down. It sounds unfamiliar even to his own ear. The words were old, shaped by centuries that did not trouble themselves with clarity. He spoke them not as declaration but as confession, unaware that confession invites answer. The answer came not boldly but gently, and for that reason it startled him. A quiet voice, measured and respectful, suggested that one word, repeated through the oath like a hinge, had been misunderstood. It was not defiance nor presumption. It was simply truth, offered without expectation of reward. The speaker did not claim authority. She merely corrected what was wrong. The moment seemed to narrow, though no one else appeared to notice. The Duke felt something unfamiliar take hold, recognition, perhaps, or the unease of having been heard too clearly. He asked her to repeat herself, and she did, explaining that honor, in the older sense, spoke not of blood but of conduct, not of lineage but of duty fulfilled toward others. It was a distinction he had never been taught to make. For her, the words carried a different risk. She had crossed an invisible boundary, one drawn not by law but by habit. Yet she spoke because silence would have been a betrayal of the man who had taught her that knowledge unused was knowledge wasted. Her father's voice lived in her restraint, in her refusal to dramatize what could be stated plainly. The Duke thanked her with formality, but formality could not disguise the disturbance within him. He recognized with sudden clarity that the oath had never demanded obedience to rank alone. It demanded judgment, and judgment required humility. That realization unsettled everything he had been preparing himself to accept. When he departed, the order of the evening resumed. Indifference returned, practiced and efficient. Duties continued. Yet something irretrievable had shifted. A thought had been planted where tradition once stood unchallenged. As the daughter of the parish clerk returned to her work, she felt the familiar weight of consequence settle upon her shoulders. She had spoken, and in doing so she had changed nothing, and perhaps everything. The shift was subtle, but it disturbed her sleep that night. She understood, too late, that truth spoken upward does not dissolve into air. It lingers, demanding response. England allowed kindness, but it punished disruption, especially when delivered by those without protection. By morning she half expected rebuke, dismissal, or the slow exile of reduced hours and colder looks. None came, which was its own form of waiting. For the Duke, the unease deepened into resolve he did not yet name. The oath followed him, not as sound, but as accusation. If honor lay in conduct, then he had been preparing to fail it by surrendering to convenience. He realized how carefully his life had been arranged to prevent such moments. She resumed her careful silence, though it no longer fit her as before. Words once spoken cannot be unspoken, and she sensed that restraint would not protect her from whatever followed. Still, she would not regret it. Some inherit land, others inherit conscience. As the Duke's journey carried him onward, he paused longer than necessity required. The pause was nothing the world could accuse, yet it held the weight of a question. He did not look back, but he did not forget. And in that unacknowledged hesitation, the ancient oath stirred, no longer dormant but awake. History rarely announces itself, yet in such moments, England's kindness had limits, and she learned them the morning the letter arrived. It was not sealed with wax, nor delivered with ceremony, yet it carried the weight of judgment. The innkeeper, uncomfortable and apologetic, informed her that certain patrons had complained. They found her manner unsettling. Too educated, too quiet, too knowing. Her father's death had already reduced her standing. Now her presence itself was deemed inconvenient. Tragedy, she understood, did not always remove what one loved. Sometimes it removed what one was allowed to be. She accepted the warning with composure, though it bruised something private. Dignity became a discipline. She worked with greater care, spoke with greater restraint, and learned the precise shape of invisibility. Yet restraint could not undo memory. The Duke's pause lingered in her thoughts like an unanswered prayer, troubling precisely because it had been sincere. For the Duke of Ashcombe, departure had not brought relief. Each mile toward London sharpened his unease. The oath, once a recitation endured, now pressed upon him as an accusation. He replayed the quiet correction, the humility with which it had been offered, and the shock of recognizing truth spoken without ambition. It unsettled him to realize that wisdom had reached him not through tutors or counsels, but through a voice society had taught him to overlook. He returned sooner than expected, though he framed the journey as necessity rather than impulse. At the inn, propriety demanded distance, and he observed it carefully. Yet before leaving, he placed a small volume upon the counter where she would find it. It was a prayer book, old but well kept, its margins marked with notes in an earlier hand. A token, modest enough to escape accusation, meaningful enough to invite interpretation. The book unsettled her more than any insult had done. It carried the intimacy of thought, not possession, and that intimacy frightened her. Gifts from power altered balance, and balance was the only protection she possessed. She hesitated before opening it, aware that knowledge, once accepted, demanded response. In the margins she recognized her father's habits reflected back to her, as though the past had reached forward unexpectedly. Rumor followed faster than reason. The Duke's pause was noticed. His return was discussed. Speculation dressed itself as concern. In drawing rooms far removed from the inn's quiet labor, it was suggested that Ashcombe's reserve masked imprudence. England's fascination with transgression often preceded its understanding of it. She became aware of the change not through accusation but through glances. Pity sharpened into curiosity. Curiosity leaned toward suspicion. Her position, already fragile, thinned further. Yet she did not discard the book. To do so would have been an act of fear, and fear had already taken too much from her. The Duke, meanwhile, faced counsel that spoke with the authority of tradition. A letter awaited him, summoning his attention to matters of alliance and expectation. His future, they reminded him, belonged not to inclination but to obligation. A suitable match had been identified, one that would strengthen the line and silence uncertainty. He read the letter without anger, but with a growing sense of estrangement from the life it assumed he would accept. When they met again, it was by chance that pretended not to be. The encounter was brief, constrained by watchful eyes, yet charged with what could not be said. He acknowledged the book with a look alone. She responded with restraint that concealed gratitude and apprehension in equal measure. Neither spoke of the oath, but both felt its presence between them, altered now by understanding. That evening she read the prayer book by lamplight, tracing the margin notes as one might trace a memory. In one passage, a word echoed the correction she had offered, confirming that her understanding had not been singular. Truth, she realized, often survived quietly, waiting for someone willing to recognize it. For the Duke, the confirmation arrived differently. He reviewed old records, long neglected, and found inconsistencies too precise to dismiss. The oath's language resisted the interpretation that had bound his family for generations. What they had obeyed was not tradition but habit. The realization brought neither triumph nor relief, only responsibility. Responsibility, once acknowledged, refused silence. He knew that acting upon it would invite consequence. England rewarded conformity and punished those who mistook conscience for permission. Yet the alternative, submission to convenience, now felt like betrayal. Loss arrived without spectacle, sudden as breath stolen mid-prayer. The letter from London was brief, decisive, and merciless in its courtesy. The Duke of Ashcombe was commanded to present himself before the family council at once, the matter described only as urgent and unavoidable. No explanation softened the demand. Tragedy did not yet have a name, but it had chosen its direction. For her, the blow fell differently. The innkeeper spoke with regret practiced to dull its edge. Her position would end within the month. Business considerations, he said. Changing expectations. No fault, no apology. She thanked him because gratitude was safer than protest, and carried the words as one carries a bruise concealed beneath cloth. To be dismissed was expected. To be dismissed quietly was England's final courtesy. The Duke read the summons twice before folding it away. The decision he had postponed now advanced without permission. London represented authority, lineage, and the collective memory of men who believed endurance was the same as virtue. He understood what would be asked of him before the question was voiced. He also understood that refusal would not be forgiven easily. She continued her duties with care sharpened by finality. Each gesture felt weighted, each courtesy a rehearsal for absence. The prayer book remained hidden among her few possessions, a presence both comforting and dangerous. It held not affection but acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had already altered the course of her life. The night before his departure, circumstance drew them into proximity once more, though neither sought it openly. The inn had quieted. Words, once avoided, pressed forward with urgency. He spoke first, not as duke but as man burdened by inheritance. He told her of the council, of the expectation that he would submit to a match chosen for him, one that aligned blood with convenience. She listened without interruption, aware that listening itself carried risk. When she spoke, it was not to advise, but to clarify what had already been said between them in fragments. The oath, she reminded him gently, did not require obedience to comfort. It demanded fidelity to meaning. Her father had believed that words, when stripped of honesty, became instruments of harm. He asked her then whether she regretted speaking. The question surprised them both. Regret was a luxury rarely afforded to those without protection. She considered carefully before answering. She said that silence would have preserved safety, but safety was not the same as integrity. Her voice did not tremble. The steadiness unsettled him more than anger would have done. For the Duke, the confession marked a shift he could not reverse. He realized that the oath's burden was not merely familial, but moral. To accept the council's decree without protest would be to affirm a lie made comfortable by repetition. He had been raised to value stability above truth, yet here truth stood, unadorned, refusing dismissal. Their exchange did not venture beyond propriety. No promises were offered. None were required. Yet something irrevocable passed between them, recognition of shared consequence. He understood that any action he took would reach her as well, though she had not asked to be involved. England had a talent for punishing proximity. When he departed at dawn, there was no farewell witnessed. He left knowing that his return would not restore what had been lost. The path forward narrowed to two directions, both costly. He carried the oath not as text, but as responsibility newly. Tragedy revealed itself not in loss alone, but in the moment when courage demanded witnesses. The Duke stood before the council once more, knowing that silence had expired. The documents lay between them, fragile pages bearing the authority of time rather than title. He spoke with care, but without retreat, presenting the corrected oath not as rebellion, but as restoration. His voice did not rise. It did not need to. Truth, once named, carries its own gravity. The council listened with faces schooled in patience. They examined the papers, recognized the handwriting, acknowledged the scholarship they had long dismissed as irrelevant. Their response was measured, which was to say dangerous. They conceded the translation's accuracy while denying its consequence. Meaning, they argued, must yield to continuity. The Duke understood then that his battle was not linguistic, but moral. They offered compromise. He might honor the spirit of the oath privately, while fulfilling its public expectation through an advantageous marriage. England excelled at such arrangements, where conscience was allowed in shadow, provided it did not disturb order. The offer was presented as generosity. It was, in truth, erasure. He refused, and the refusal altered the room. The cost was named without drama. Disinheritance need not be immediate, but it would be thorough. Estates could be reassigned. Influence could diminish. Legacy, carefully cultivated, could be revised. The Duke accepted the terms with composure that unsettled them. He had known this reckoning would arrive. Preparation did not lessen its weight. While London calculated, she prepared to depart. The inn no longer belonged to her, nor did the village that had tolerated her presence. She packed lightly, preserving only what could not be replaced. Her father's papers remained her anchor, not because they offered security, but because they affirmed purpose. Knowledge had been her inheritance. She would not abandon it now. A message reached her before dawn, requesting her presence not at the inn, but at a nearby parish. The tone was formal, the request unmistakable. She recognized the handwriting only after careful study. He did not ask for comfort. He asked for witness. She understood what that would require of her. They met without ceremony. He spoke plainly of the council's decision, of the price he would pay for refusal. He did not soften the truth, nor did he dramatize it. She listened, aware that his sacrifice would be interpreted not as virtue but as folly. England admired endurance, not deviation. She responded with equal honesty. She told him that his choice had already altered the meaning of the oath more than any translation could. By refusing compromise, he had restored integrity to a promise long hollowed by convenience. Her words did not console, they clarified. He thanked her because gratitude was all that remained appropriate. The decision before them was unspoken, yet present. Association would amplify consequence. Distance would offer protection, though neither believed in it fully. He did not ask her to stand beside him. She did not offer herself uninvited. Yet the silence between them acknowledged that separation would be another form of surrender. The council's influence moved quickly. Notices were circulated. Alliances withdrawn. The Duke's position, while not yet stripped, was rendered precarious. Rumor reframed his refusal as infatuation, a weakness unbecoming of station. The woman at the center of speculation remained unnamed, which was itself a sentence. Anonymity, once protection, now invited invention. She felt the shift in how she was regarded even beyond the village. Politeness cooled. Doors closed with practiced civility. England did not need proof to judge. Proximity sufficed. Still she did not retreat. Withdrawal would have suggested guilt. She carried herself with quiet resolve, aware that dignity was the last possession no one could confiscate without consent. The Duke returned to Ashcombe not in triumph, but in defiance of expectation. The estate greeted him with uncertainty. Servants waited for instruction that might signal stability or collapse. He addressed them not as lord asserting authority, but as steward reaffirming responsibility. Honor, he declared, would govern conduct regardless of consequence. The words were simple. Their effect was not. She received one final message delivered without seal. It informed her that the oath would be presented publicly in full before the family and those who served the estate. Her father's papers would be cited. Her presence was requested not as subject but as source. The request carried risk beyond measure. To attend would be to step fully into scrutiny. To refuse would be to abandon the truth she had protected. She considered the choice with a clarity born of loss. Safety had already been forfeited. Silence would preserve nothing of value. She replied with acceptance, her hand steady despite the knowledge that England rarely forgave women who spoke plainly. History breaks hearts before it crowns them, and the reckoning arrived with quiet finality. The assembly gathered not to celebrate tradition, but to measure its failure, and every name spoken carried weight. The Duke stood among them, stripped of illusion yet steady, knowing the cost already paid. She entered without title or defense, carrying proof rather than entitlement, and England watched. Tragedy lingered in the possibility that truth might still be refused, that courage might be punished without remedy. Silence deepened, not hostile but expectant, as if the past itself leaned forward, demanding resolution from those it had long constrained. The documents were read aloud, their language plain once restored, revealing how long habit had obscured meaning. Murmurs followed, not of outrage but recognition reluctantly earned. Elders exchanged looks shaped by calculation, then by something rarer, humility pressed upon them by evidence. The oath, they conceded, bound honor to conduct, not blood alone. In that admission generations seemed to exhale. The Duke did not claim victory. He accepted responsibility, acknowledging harm done by obedience without understanding. She listened, aware that vindication carried risk, and that acceptance today did not guarantee mercy tomorrow. Yet hope persisted, cautious, resilient, and transforming futures. The council withdrew to deliberate, though deliberation felt ceremonial after concession. Waiting became the final trial, measured in breaths rather than hours. She felt the familiar vulnerability of standing exposed, yet something steadier replaced fear. The Duke remained near, not in possession but in solidarity, his presence deliberate and restrained. When the council returned, their verdict was careful yet irrevocable. The oath would stand corrected. The Duke would retain his title, though his authority would be reshaped by duty rather than privilege. Consequences remained, but ruin was denied. Relief surfaced slowly, tempered by memory, responsibility, and watchful expectation from others. The assembly dissolved, leaving aftermath rather than applause. Some departed offended, others thoughtful, none unchanged. She gathered her father's papers, aware that his quiet scholarship had altered history more than any speech. The Duke approached her without ceremony, gratitude evident yet unspoken. He acknowledged debt, not ownership, promising restitution measured in action. She replied with restraint, reminding him that truth required stewardship beyond gratitude. Their exchange remained public, proper, and carefully limited, yet those who observed sensed alignment rather than impropriety. England noticed and in noticing adjusted its expectations. Change rarely announces itself, it settles, persistent and undeniable over time. Later, away from judgment, consequence took gentler shape. The Duke offered her choice rather than rescue, asking what future she desired now unbound from dismissal. She answered honestly, seeking purpose without spectacle, service without erasure. He listened, accepting limits as structure rather than denial. Arrangements followed that restored her father's posthumous recognition and secured her independence through education and work. Affection remained unspoken, not denied but disciplined, allowed to grow within respect. For the first time, possibility felt earned, not granted by mercy or fear. Patience, once imposed, became chosen, strengthening resolve daily with quiet confidence and measured hope ahead. Time advanced without spectacle, marked by consistency rather than upheaval. The estate adjusted to leadership grounded in accountability, and those who served felt difference immediately. He governed attentively, mindful that honor required visibility, not distance. She pursued her work with diligence, respected for competence rather than novelty. Their meetings remained infrequent, deliberate, and sincere, shaped by mutual regard. Gossip weakened when deprived of scandal. England, disappointed by restraint, turned its appetite elsewhere. What remained was steadier than passion, built from trust tested publicly and sustained privately, a foundation capable of bearing future storms. It endured beyond expectation with quiet certainty. Yet endings rarely conclude without echo. A letter arrived bearing acknowledgement from the council, formal and restrained, confirming her contribution to the oath's restoration. The recognition was modest but official, securing her place within record rather than rumor. She read it without triumph, aware that validation did not erase hardship endured. The Duke received similar correspondence, warning that scrutiny would persist. He accepted oversight willingly, preferring accountability to unchecked privilege. Their paths, though aligned, remained distinct, proving that union need not erase individuality to achieve harmony. Respect deepened, sustained by choice rather than necessity alone within changing seasons ahead together. When he asked at last, the question carried no command. It was framed as invitation, acknowledging risk equally shared. She considered, not his title but his conduct, remembering refusal when compromise beckoned. Her answer was measured yet resolute, accepting partnership grounded in purpose, not elevation. They agreed upon terms that preserved her work and his duty, neither diminished. The decision traveled quietly, provoking less outrage than expected, as though England, exhausted by spectacle, permitted decency its moment. Commitment emerged not as escape, but as deliberate continuation of responsibility. Love followed, disciplined, patient, and publicly accountable through time, choice, trust shared. The oath, once burden, became compass. Its fulfillment reshaped Ashcombe's legacy, aligning authority with service. Those who labored upon the land felt seen, their welfare addressed without condescension. She continued to translate, teach, and preserve, ensuring that language would not again become weapon through neglect. He stood beside her when appropriate, behind her when necessary, and apart when duty required independence. Their bond resisted spectacle, favoring steadiness. In this restraint, happiness grew durable, protected from envy and erosion, an achievement England rarely celebrated but deeply required. It endured quietly, strengthening lives beyond their own and correcting history's harsher assumptions gently. Still, resolution never seals fate entirely. As years settled, whispers softened into reflection, and the oath's correction entered record rather than legend. Yet memory persisted of how narrowly truth escaped erasure. The Duke and the scholar, bound by choice,